Okay, just setting up everything here. Hi, everyone. It's Thursday at 5 p.m., and therefore you are at the bar. I'm Inez Stepman with Independent Women's Forum.
And I'm Jennifer Braceras with Independent Women's Law Center. Today, I'd like to raise a glass as we celebrate our 10th virtual happy hour conversation about issues at the intersection of law, politics, and culture.
Yes, I'm being highly disappointing. I'm actually in the middle of a move. So as I was telling Jennifer before we got on, my bar cart and all attendant boozes has been rolled to our other apartment already. So all I had was this Coke can. So I'm just going to have to be disappointing this happy hour. But we had talked about maybe doing an at the bar on the legal efforts to force women to register for the draft. There was that Senate committee vote about making women register for this elective service. So we were going to talk about that, but then we saw that the Olympics obviously just wrapped up. And so we decided to switch gears for this show and talk about a legal issue that has been covered a lot with regard specifically to the women's soccer team, whether it's regard to their Olympic performance or their other performances in the various leagues in which they participate. There's a domestic one, and I'm not a soccer fan. So there's a domestic one and a world one, and then there's the Olympics. But what we would like to talk about is the claim by Megan Rapinoe and her soccer teammates that the United States Soccer Federation actually pays them less because they are women in comparison to the men's team. Essentially, what they're doing is launching an equal pay claim, both in the courts and in the court of public opinion. So that's what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, this case is super interesting to me, Inez, for so many reasons, because really Megan Rapinoe, or Rapinoe, however, I'm not really quite sure how you pronounce it, but I'm going to go with Rapinoe. She and her teammates have really been fighting and winning this battle in the court of public opinion. Most people just sort of assume that the female soccer players have been discriminated against, sort of an article of faith in the Twitterverse. People assume they've been paid less than the male soccer players. But in fact, a federal court held over a year ago that they were not paid less than the men. In fact, they were paid more than the men. And the federal judge dismissed the pay discrimination portion of their case, which is now on appeal.
Yeah, and we're going to get into like all the different ways that you could measure their pay, because this turns out to not be a cut and dried, because they get paid in a variety of different ways that are different from the men's team. However, what we also want to start off with is the kind of public pressure around this case, that the sort of celebrities and politicians weighing in on this case. And it seems largely like the assumption is because they're female, they are somehow being underpaid in some way. People aren't really, obviously it's Twitter. Nobody is going into the details of the contracts of these two teams and the law involved. But what they are doing is kind of putting forward that blanket assertion that somehow this is emblematic of how women are underpaid in the United States. So I'm going to throw up a couple of those tweets. So we have AOC here. At this point, we shouldn't even be asking for equal pay. We should demand they should be paid at least twice as much. Oh, well, that makes sense. We've got Shonda Rhimes here. These athletes generate more revenue and garner higher TV ratings, but are paid less simply because they are women. It's time for the federation to correct this disparity once and for all. And then finally, we've got the president weighing in here, Joe Biden. Don't give up this fight. It's not over yet. To U.S. soccer, equal pay now, or else when I'm president, you can go elsewhere for World Cup funding. So we have the then candidate for president, now the president, Joe Biden, threatening the soccer federation and saying that basically assuming that they are unfairly paying the women's soccer team. So obviously the folks tweeting about this know very little. I mean, even the politicians involved, it's not like they're not on at the bar, so they're not going to delve into how the women's and men's teams are paid. But there is this very overwhelming underlying assumption that women generally in the United States are underpaid because they are women. And of course, IWF and the legal center, we've been pushing back against this assumption because it is so damaging, even though it's so widely spread. Famously, President Obama was constantly quoting this 79 cents on the dollar statistic that was blown out of the water by a review by his own labor department that actually produced a mega data sort of survey of all kinds of studies that have been conducted on female pay. And it turns out that when you account for all kinds of factors, which we'll get into, that pay gap narrows all the way down to a cent or two. And even that cannot really be attributed to discrimination. So Obama's own labor department debunked the statistic that he continued to use after they released that report. And I really see this whole debate over the soccer team pay being emblematic of how much misinformation and myth-making there has been around this issue more generally.
Yeah, it's true, because most people don't realize that equal pay laws have been on the books in this country since the 1960s, the early 1960s. The Equal Pay Act was actually one of the first laws passed, one of the first civil rights laws passed to protect women. It was passed even before the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So the Equal Pay Act prohibits pay discrimination outright. Title VII, which was passed the following year in 1964, that prohibits sex discrimination in employment more broadly. And so both laws prohibit employers from paying similarly situated male and female employees differently. But of course, similarly situated is the key, because, obviously, a law firm is going to pay their first-year associates the same amount, whether they're male or female. There's not a law firm in the country that doesn't do that now. But then down the road, different factors come into play. Have people taken time off? Have people, has one employee been working from home more than the other? Has one employee taken on more complex cases? Has one employee, done a better job, right? So at the beginning of an employment relationship, oftentimes most people are exactly the same. They come in with very similar credentials, very similar degrees and backgrounds. But as time goes on in a professional workplace, it's very hard often to compare employees. You can do it in the unionized context much more easily. But that's where a lot of the differences come into play. And as you know, Inez, when you do crunch the numbers and actually compare apples to apples, what you see is actually the pay gap shrinks to about 2 cents on the dollar. So there is a small pay gap, but most of the pay gap goes away when you compare levels of education, hours put in on the job, all sorts of things. And so when you crunch those numbers, as you pointed out, the Obama Labor Department did, the pay gap pretty much disappears in almost all cases.
That's right. And my favorite counterexample to the narrative here is really Uber, which is just, there was this fascinating experiment that they ran because, of course, Uber actually pays by algorithm. So it takes out a lot of that subjectivity that you were referencing in terms of promoting one person over another. It literally has a formula that does not obviously take into account the sex of the driver. So it turns out that Uber has a 7% pay gap between its female and male drivers. And they released a report saying that was largely due to speed of driving, hours the driver worked, because it was controlled for hours, right? Because it pays by the hour. So number of hours worked wasn't necessarily a factor, but like what hours worked was, because Uber pays more for certain inconvenient hours where it may not be fun or convenient to actually go on the job.
At certain times.
Right. So it was just a great lifetime experiment that shows that the differences between men and women and the different decisions they actually make about their careers produce this kind of pay gap, even when the way that employees are paid, or in this case, not employees, because Uber has contractors, and that's a whole other issue. But even the way that drivers are paid is completely by algorithm. You still see these disparities that are then attributed to discrimination and so on. But this is such a frustrating topic to me, because I feel like I know the left loves to say like the science says, right? But in this case, the science is in.
The data is in. The data is in. There's also another study similar to the one you just described about Uber. There's a study out of Harvard Business School where they looked at unionized employees who work in the Boston transportation sector. So I guess bus drivers and T operators and stuff like that. And so those are unionized employees. And so those employees are all paid exactly the same depending on when they join the union. It's all about tenure in a union. And even there, the women, there's a pay gap and the women end up taking home less than men. What Harvard Business School found that the reason behind that is because the men are willing to take on overtime, whereas the women on average tend to reject overtime hours because they want to get home to their families. So again, that's a choice. Their take-home pay, their rate of pay is the same. Their take-home pay ends up being less because they're working fewer overtime hours.
Yeah, I mean, this really, like I said, this issue really frustrates me, not just because of the seeming imperviousness to the facts of the entire discussion, but also because the assumption of the discussion is if there's a disparity in pay over these huge averages, that there's essentially either discrimination or when you do introduce the fact that these confounding factors and different behavior does introduce the pay gap at the like aggregate level between men and women, the assumption is that like, I know this is the opposite of how they present it, but really what they're saying is there's something wrong with the decisions that women are making, right? If women are not making the same decisions as men are about balancing their careers and homes and families, then there's something wrong with a system, or there's something wrong with women who are making those choices. They're making the wrong choices because the standard to which women's performance essentially in decision-making is pegged is the male choices. And who's to say like who's making better decisions here? I mean, there aren't a lot of people on their deathbed who regret not working more hours, right? And so it just bothers me the way this whole issue is framed.
Also the left wants the private sector and the public sector to basically compensate for what they view as the systemic sexism of marriages and families, right? Where, it's still the case that, I mean, there are a lot of men who are stay-at-home dads nowadays, but it's still the case that, it's the women who are rushing home to pick up the kids from soccer practice, not the men. And so they view that as a societal problem, societal discrimination. And so they expect the employers to make that right, level it out. Whether you think it's a systemic problem to begin with is a whole nother question. But even if you agree with them that this is some sort of societal sexism, is it really the role of the private sector to solve that?
Right. Of course not. But none of this nuance makes it into the sort of conversation on this issue, particularly with regard to this women's soccer team. In fact, I'm going to roll a trailer here for an entire movie about their battle against systemic sexism to get themselves paid. So we're going to roll a bit of that.
This group is just so bad. We have pink hair and purple hair, tattoos, dreadlocks. White girls, black girls. Yes, we play sports. Yes, we play soccer. But we're so much more than that.
We were ready to show the world real talent, real energy, real competitive drive.
But the story's the same everywhere. Women get paid less to do the same job. The fight for equal pay has been going on since this team started.
The mindset back then was you should just be grateful, darling, that you have a place to play.
Even though I'm on the USA team, I have to coach just to make ends meet. Childcare is more than my paychecks.
The men's team get more money, more marketing, better fields.
We were very frustrated and very angry. It's not fair.
The women on the U.S. soccer team are suing the U.S. Soccer Federation for equal pay. USSF does argue some women on the team got more compensation than some of the men did.
It's like, really?
And then it was like, hold my beer.
If we win this World Cup, they would have no choice but to be on our side. That's when I felt the movement.
We've got the entire world on our side.
I want to leave this team better than I found it on and also off the field.
This will be one of those landmark decisions talked about for decades.
Anything less than winning is a failure.
If you want the world to look a certain way, you have to fight to get there.
It is time.
It is time.
It is time.
Let's go.
Let's go!
I'm about had enough to hear with her and her pink hair.
Yeah, well, that's the real problem here, right? Like the patriarchy hates her pink hair, and that's why she's not getting paid properly. No, I mean, look, they're right about one thing. They have successfully messaged this issue. They have people on their side, and people just assume that they're telling the truth. Jennifer, can you just break down for us, first of all, what the judge in this case found? And then second of all, how do the men's and women's contracts differ? Because it's actually quite complicated.
Yeah. So unlike, some of the other contexts that we've talked about, U.S. soccer teams they're unionized workplaces. So the men's team has a labor union and the women's team has a union, and they separately bargain with the U.S. Soccer Federation for contracts that determine how they're paid. So in this case, the judge, he looked at the expert testimony on both sides and he crunched all the numbers. And the first thing he found was that overall, the men's team as a group gets paid more than the women's team, both overall and on a per game basis. And I think we have a little graphic that points out the exact numbers. It's that timeout graphic with the picture of our hero, Megan. There it is. So overall, the women's team at the time relevant to the lawsuit took home $24 million compared to the men's team, which took home $18 million. And on a per game basis, the women collected $220,747, and the men took home $212,639,000. So overall, in fact, the women make more than the men. But what's also important to note about their contracts is that they are structured entirely differently. So the men have a pay-to-play contract. They only get paid when they step foot on the field. They do not get paid if they're on sick leave. They do not get paid if they don't make a tournament and they have to stay home if they're not rostered for a particular tournament. The women get paid a salary, and they get paid that salary irrespective of whether they play. So, for example, during COVID, the women continued to get paid. The men didn't get a dime. So big difference. The women chose stability over, the uncertainty of whether or not each player would make a roster for a certain tournament. Because just because you're on the team doesn't mean you go to every game. You go to these training camps, and then the coach decides which players he's taking or she's taking to a certain tournament. And so the men get paid only in bonuses. The women get their salary, and then they get some bonuses based on whether they play, whether they lose, win, or tie. And their complaint is essentially that their bonuses are less than the men's bonuses. And so the judge said, essentially, that's ridiculous. You chose this contract. This is the contract you chose. And as a team, you actually make more. So he dismissed the part of their case under the Equal Pay Act and under Title VII where they alleged pay discrimination. What he did not dismiss are their claims of general unequal working conditions. And so essentially they argued in their case that they don't get the same travel stipends, they don't get as nice hotels or airplanes, their locker rooms aren't as good, their perks and their swag aren't as good, I guess. I don't know, whatever. Well, all of the miscellaneous things, their training opportunities. And the judge said that on that issue, there was enough evidence to go to trial. And the U.S. Soccer Federation very quickly settled that portion of the case because I'm sure there are huge inequities in that stuff. But when it came to pay, the judge said they didn't have a case.
Yeah, it's funny. In some ways, this case really is emblematic, just in a totally different way than they want it to be, right? Like the way that HBO movie is set up, the way that this is talked about is, look, even these world champion women are not getting equal pay. And we hear that this issue talked about that from that perspective a lot. So the other kind of group of women who are speaking out about this that comes to mind are highly paid actresses, right? So, and they'll say that on a given, and that's much more subjective as to, what the relative value of each character that you're casting in a Hollywood movie like brings to the table. So there are these women who are saying, well, my male co-star made $17 million and I only made $10 million for the same movie where we had, sort of similar parts or whatever. And I think it's emblematic in the way that it's totally disconnected from how women, ordinary women, really like structure their careers. And it's emblematic in the way that actually even these women who are now complaining about the contract that they negotiated and their union negotiated, guess what they wanted to negotiate at the time? As you said, stability, right? And that's one of the major things that studies find that women prefer more than men do. Men tend to do more shoot for the moon kind of propositions. And that's exactly what we see with the men's team. They don't get paid at all if they don't step foot. There's a lot of guys who are, working really hard and then just, not making the team for that tournament and getting paid $0. But when they do step foot on it, there's a higher payoff. We're finding that, in a lot of these studies that men have a higher risk tolerance than women do. Women tend to try to minimize risk. They also maximize flexibility. They maximize for different things other than the highest pay possible, which is why one of the many reasons, among others, like choosing different college majors is a huge difference. Number of years in the workforce is a huge difference. Hours worked even among those who are considered full-time. So you can be considered full-time. I believe it's at 37 hours a week. Might even be 35, but even within there, you see that men who work full-time actually work something closer to 45 hours a week on average, whereas women are just under 40 a week. And these are all full-time employees.
These men also have a higher risk tolerance for types of occupations. So you don't, for example, see a lot of female coal miners or deep sea fishermen. I mean, you see some, but the jobs that are most risky to life and limb are still heavily dominated by men because they tend to take on more risk.
Yeah, and we're seeing exactly in live time with these women insisting that they want essentially the payout of the high risk gamble that the men took, but they don't want to give up. One presumes they don't want to give up the stability part of their contract. They don't want to give up getting paid during COVID when there were no soccer games. They don't want to give up the stability of getting that monthly paycheck or biweekly paycheck that they know is going to show up, and organizing their lives around that. So in that sense, I really do think it's emblematic. We have this conversation in a way that doesn't talk about other benefits besides the bottom line highest salary.
Right. And it's not just that the men have a pay to play and they have a salary. They have other benefits. They get maternity leaves. They get severance pay if they get cut from the team. The men don't get any of those things. And I read somewhere, I may not get my numbers exactly right, but I think the men's team roster is approximately 50 guys. And there are only about 13 who play regularly in all their tournaments. Everybody else isn't getting paid. I mean, they might go to a few tournaments, or a few matches, but they're not getting paid enough to sustain, a yearly salary. Whereas the women, it might not be as much as they want, but they're getting regular paychecks.
This really goes back to what I think is a theme both for the Law Center and for IW generally, which is, equality between men and women does not have to look like men and women being the same. Right. And in fact, it may be, and in fact, we will argue that it is better for women to be recognized as making different decisions because they are women, and to go ahead and embrace those decisions that are different than men, rather than trying to essentially cram women into a system and standard that is created by men, because men do have different priorities. And we're seeing that even in these two powerful teams, right? They're the best of the world in what they do, or at least they came, I think in third in the Olympics, so they're not anymore. But they're certainly, some of the best in the world at what they do. And yet we still see even these kinds of high-powered women behaving in a way that the men's team isn't, with regard to what they value when they negotiated it, instead of what now after the fact, where they want to change the game and get essentially both upsides and no downsides. We see them behaving very much like women.
Right, exactly. I saw some people asking on Twitter, well, why would they say they're discriminated against if they're not? I mean, obviously they feel they've been mistreated by the U.S. Soccer Federation. And what I think is interesting about that is I think there are lots of reasons they might make this claim, even knowing that when you crunch the numbers, their pay claims aren't valid. One reason is it's a tool for collective bargaining, right? You get all of this negative publicity going against U.S. Soccer Federation. And when they have to come to the table to renegotiate their contract, that puts a lot of pressure on them. So, I think I do think it's a tool. Also, I think, there's something to be said for the fact that in this country, victim status is coin of the realm. And I wrote that in a Boston Herald article about this. These women have been feted by Hollywood. They've been, as you pointed out at the beginning, praised by politicians, by AOC, by the President of the United States, by Shonda Rhimes. And they're heroes for fighting for equal pay. There's a value in that to them, a value that they then monetize with endorsements. So there's a lot going on here that makes this very different from your run-of-the-mill equal pay case, where somebody just goes into the office and finds out that their colleague at the next desk is being paid more. That's not really what this is all about. There's a whole bunch of other stuff going on here, I think.
I'd like to ask you this, Jennifer, given that your background is in labor law. When you talk about why an employee might bring this kind of case, what are the steps, and what is the more typical case if a woman was to bring an action underneath that Paycheck Fairness Act or underneath the Equal Pay Act of 1963? I mean, what are the remedies available if a woman feels that she is being, or suspects that her pay is being docked in comparison to her male colleagues unfairly?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that if anybody feels that they're being paid unfairly, or has evidence to show that they're being treated unfairly, they should seek legal counsel, and they should bring a lawsuit. In most cases, I would imagine that an employer would settle that and rectify it very quickly. Employers aren't deliberately trying to pay women less than men. If it's brought to their attention that there's an inequity that there's no business justification for, I think 95% of all employees would very quickly try to rectify that. So I would definitely argue that women should, or men, if the men are being paid less, talk to a lawyer and try to get it fixed. The other thing is, what's interesting is that these laws have been really successful. And they're trying to amend them to make it easier to bring lawsuits in a way that's really not necessary at this point. I mean, what they want to do is they want to, some of the bills that are pending in Congress, they want to switch the burden of proof essentially to the employer, so that if there's some sort of an equity, statistically speaking, in terms of groups, the burden is on the employer to explain why that's so. And a lot of the bills also set up really sort of, I think, intrusive monitoring systems that require employers to report pay data to the government every year. And so, of course, what that's going to do is if you have to submit raw numbers to the Department of Labor, and it's going to be, bureaucrats are going to be going through it with a fine-tooth comb, you're prophylactically, I think, as an employer, going to try to make sure that those numbers don't look in any way disparate on the basis of sex, even though there might be very real reasons why those disparities exist, such as number of hours worked or whatever, or specific types of jobs within the company. So employers will, in the first instance, try to even everything out. Now, some people might say, well, that's good. They should even everything out. Everybody should just get paid the same. But what that takes away from employees and women in particular is the ability to negotiate any sort of flexible arrangement or any sort of individual arrangement that suits, her needs. It takes away the ability to say, gee, I'd like to work from home 3 days a week. The answer from the employer is immediately going to be, I can't do that for you if I don't do it for everybody else. I have to pay you the exact same, and you have to be in the office the exact same number of hours. Everything has to be the same. And that's not good for women.
Yeah, I think there are two issues that you bring up here that I want to dig deeper on. The first is, of course, just to reference what we've been talking about most of the last half an hour, which is that these disparities don't equal discrimination. And if we have legislation about equal pay that assumes essentially that disparities do equal discrimination, we're just going to have a giant mess on our hands.
Right.
Because
just to be clear, disparities can sometimes indicate that there's something nefarious going on, right? They can be one piece of evidence in a discrimination case, whether it's a race discrimination case or otherwise. But disparities by themselves are never dispositive.
Right, because as we discussed, especially with regard to this topic as opposed to race, I think this is actually clearer than race in that regard. Yes. Because men and women, as we've been saying, make different decisions. Women tend to value flexibility more. They tend to, for example, go into different fields altogether. Like in the same company, you might have somebody, for example, with a background in communications versus somebody with a background, even in the same job, you come in with different skills, somebody in a background of petroleum engineering, right? Which tends to be a male-dominated major. But so first of all, it's a blunt instrument. The idea that disparities automatically mean discrimination is a totally blunt instrument that rolls over the different choices that women make throughout their careers and lives. But the second idea that you kind of brought up there is this idea of the burden of proof. And here we're seeing a broader push to get rid of these kinds of standards that make it difficult to sort of get the bad guys, right? And we talked about this the last time with Andy McCarthy when we were talking about Bill Cosby getting let out of jail, and with regard to Kavanaugh, the Kavanaugh hearings, and with regard to, for example, Title IX cases on college campuses. It seems like as a society, we're losing tolerance for the traditional sort of Anglo-American legal principle that it's better to let a lot of, guilty defendants go free than it is to convict. And I know we're not talking about the criminal cases here in the criminal context here, but we're losing this idea of the presumption of innocence, right? If you flip the burden, it means that when these companies are going to go to court, let's say one of these pieces of proposed legislation passes and we flip the burden, that means companies are going into court essentially in a kind of opposite way to our traditional legal system, right? They're going into court with the assumption that they have to prove that they are not discriminatory against women with their pay scales. And it seems to me like we're losing, I don't know, culturally the tolerance for just saying, okay, that there are going to be some bad actors and maybe some bad actors are going to slip through, but it's more important that we set our standards generally so that we are not, in this case, it's not a criminal conviction, but like we're not ruling against
the person
companies.
Making the accusation is supposed to prove their case. That's the way our system works. And frankly, I used to represent a lot of management side in the labor and employment context. They're risk averse when it comes to litigation. Employers are risk averse. They don't want to have to go to court. They don't want to pay people unequally. they might want to, in terms of money, they might want to pay people less as a group to save money in terms of their business plan. But they're not looking to pay women less than men overall. And they're really, for the most part, trying to comply with these laws because they don't want to have to go to court. Litigation is expensive. It's expensive to hire labor economists to crunch the numbers and explain to a judge, look, when you really account for this, that, and the other thing, these people made the same amount of money. Employers don't want to have to do that. So, the bottom line is that the law at this point in time, since the 1960s, has required that employers pay men and women equally. And if you think you're not being paid equally, then you need to advocate for yourself. You either need to negotiate a better arrangement with your employer, or you need to talk to a lawyer and get the lawyer to get your company to try to straighten it out. And if they don't, then you can take them to court. But the truth is, as we've seen, the pay gap in most cases is very, very small and is not discriminatory in 9 cases out of 10, if not more.
Yeah, I mean, and I worry about also how we talk about this issue. It's essentially, it's so discouraging, I think, to a lot of women in multiple ways. One, as we mentioned, it implies that there's something wrong with organizing your life, with your income as coming from your career not being the first among many, many other considerations in your life. And it places sort of a stigma on women who might say, that's like, my paycheck is probably my 3rd or 4th or 5th concern after, my family, after, where I want to live, after how many hours I want to spend at work. Right. So that worries me. And on the flip side, it paints this picture, which is just not true. That women as a class are like, that corporations, that the employers that were your clients, Jennifer, are just looking for ways to underpay and screw women because they are sexist and they would prefer to have men in all of these jobs. And I think that's so damaging. Yeah, it's not true. And it's such a damaging myth to perpetuate, or we're raising a generation of women who are going in with this victimhood mentality. And then, of course, they see sexism everywhere, because any unpleasant thing that happens to you, which will happen to you, woman, man, it doesn't matter. Like, unpleasant things in your career will happen to you. You will work for people that don't like you. You will, have problems with your coworkers. You will be passed over for promotions. That happens to every single person.
You won't get the raise or the bonus you wanted.
Right. It happens to every single person unless they're very, very lucky in the course of their career. And because we have, these HBO movies about how even these, really famous top of their game soccer players are really just suffering under the yoke of sexism and not being paid equally for equal work, the message we're sending out there is just so damaging and discouraging.
Yeah, I mean, right. The mantra is, if it can happen to the sainted Megan Rapinoe, it's definitely happening to you too, right? I mean, it's sort of absurd. But, you would think that by now people would sort of realize that the cry for equal pay is really a rallying cry, sort of either to get voters to the polls or it's a negotiating tool for people who are under a collective bargaining agreement, because time and time again, right, we've seen the numbers crunched, and we've also seen there have been some really sort of hilarious pieces done by the Washington Free Beacon where they'll like crunch the numbers of the pay in Senator Kamala Harris's office or Hillary Clinton's, First Lady office, and guess who has a big pay gap on their staff? The people who are out there tweeting about the U.S. women's soccer team, right? The people are out there tweeting, we need equal pay. And you look at their staff, the raw numbers show a pay gap. Now, do I think that Hillary Clinton was discriminating against women in the workplace and paying them less? No. Do I think that Kamala Harris was doing that in her Senate office? No. I think that just like every other employer, people are paid based on these different factors, and the raw numbers don't tell the whole story.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I was thinking about that, but I'm glad you brought it up. Like the fact that even these people, these politicians who are out there talking about the pay gap, the 79 cents myth, all of these things, it is just a political tool. And you see that when you look at their own staffs. And of course, as soon as those stories ran at the Free Beacon, you get the explanation saying, well, yes, we're going to look at this, but this is not the sole explanation. The women in our office are more junior than the men are for a variety of reasons, blah, blah, blah. Well, of course, that's also the case with all of these corporations and other employers that they are trying essentially to intimidate with this kind of rhetoric, and with, as you mentioned, proposals to make them report all of that raw data, which they know is probably going to contain disparities between men and women, because men and women do make different choices. That's what all of the social science tells us. And the crux of this debate, I think, is between folks like us at IW who embrace the fact that we live in a free and prosperous enough country that women do have the freedom to make the kind of choices that they want to about balancing their careers and family lives, and to make those choices that are different than men. We see that, I think, as like an enormous blessing, as something to be grateful for. And indeed, actually, one of the funnier kind of statistics surrounding this issue is that the more you see actually the wealthier a country is, and the more quote unquote gender equality you see in kind of a superficial basis, the bigger in some cases the pay gap gets, right? So Sweden and
all the Scandinavian countries.
Right. So these Scandinavian countries actually have quite big pay gaps between men and women when you consider the raw data. And that's because, in large part, because they are wealthy enough. They have huge maternity leave policies. They have a lot of benefits for young families, and more women are choosing there to stay home. And then the flip side of that is places like Somalia, for example, where you have basically no pay gap, or in some cases, women are making more than men are. And that's because they're living on a subsistence basis, and both men and women have to work, from dusk till dawn to produce enough to then go ahead and feed their families. That's not something that we should be looking up to, right? The fact that
that's something to aspire to.
Right. This is not something that we want to change in our own prosperous and free society when we see men and women making different choices. Ultimately, to me, I look at the disparities. I actually, at one point a long time ago, wrote a piece about this headline: "How I Learned How to Stop Worrying and Love the Pay Gap." Little reference there to Dr. Strangelove, but
yeah.
I really, it sounds ridiculous to say, but I really think we need to embrace this pay gap. It is, in fact, all the social science is telling us that the pay gap is the result of women making free choices that they think are better for themselves and their families. And that's not a reason to go on the barricades and try to fix as a problem, but instead something to be grateful for.
Well, and the other thing it doesn't take into consideration at all is sort of this new economy and the way people work, with all sorts of side hustles and freelancing. I mean, really, the whole edifice of an equal pay analysis is based on the notion that everybody has a 9-to-5 job, that they get up and they go to a workplace, whether it's a factory or an office, and they work their 40-hour work week, and that's what it is. But the reality is, a lot of people now, particularly millennials and younger generations, they don't want to work that way. And our equal pay laws don't really take that into consideration. They're not looking at what are you making on your side hustle, and is the job that's supposedly discriminating against you, maybe it's giving you the flexibility you want so that you can go out and, make a lot selling your art on the side and, other stuff. So there's that whole analysis too. But I did want to raise one thing, before we end up wrapping up, is another way that that this soccer case is really political, is that the real disparity in money has nothing to do with the U.S. Soccer Federation. It has to do with the FIFA World Cup prize money. And there is a big disparity there between the prize money for the women and the prize money for the men. And you don't hear Megan Rapinoe complaining about that. I mean, maybe she does tangentially, but her beef is with the U.S. Soccer Federation. Why? I mean, the U.S. Soccer Federation has offered to lock arms with these women and to go to the FIFA World Cup and demand bigger prize money for the women. They're on their side. They want to be their advocates. But these women don't want to join forces with them to advocate for equal prize money because they've got this other thing going on, this publicity stunt where, U.S. Soccer Federation has to be the bad guy.
Right. And of course, a major reason for that disparity at the World Cup level is the differing. And maybe that is going to change going forward. Maybe there is more interest in women's soccer. But in the past, the men's World Cup has drawn many, many more viewers and has generated a lot more revenue. And therefore, there is more of that revenue available as a prize. But maybe that'll change going forward. Maybe it won't. But at the end of the day, I still wouldn't call that discrimination. It's the reality that another topic for another day, that the fact that men and women have different physical abilities. And in fact, even though the men's soccer team may not be as relatively good to other men's soccer teams around the world as the women's are, the women are, if there was a matchup between the men's and women's soccer team, everyone knows how that would go. And in fact, this team lost a scrimmage to, I believe it was the boys under 15 division. So there are major differences in male and female athletic ability, which does not at all take away from the fact that these women were at one point the best in the world and apparently now the third best.
And on that
note, we'll dig in. Well, I think we're going to wrap up here. But thank you so much for joining us at the bar. We are here every 2 weeks. I'm Inez Stepman with the Independent Women Forum.
And I'm Jennifer Braceras with Independent Women's Law Center.
And join us next week for more issues at the intersection of law, politics, and culture.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm trying to find our there we go.